Welcome back to NoPro Worship. My name is David Wesley. Last week's video was a 20-minute tutorial about how to choose keys for congregational singing. If you haven't seen that video yet, feel free to check out the link above or in the video description below. It'll provide a little bit more context for today's discussion. Last week I also introduced a piece of software that I'm working on called the Rangefinder. It's a useful online tool that provides you a very visual, very high-level analysis of a song and tells you the pros and cons of singing in one key or another. I'll be using this tool again today. So this week I want to talk about just one difference between some more traditional hymns and contemporary worship songs, and that is in terms of vocal range. I mentioned last week that many hymns have a range of an octave and sometimes less that can be put into a range that's comfortable for a congregation, and that some modern songs really start to stretch that so it can actually be difficult for everybody to sing together in unison. So if I really wanted to, I could cherry pick from either category if I wanted to make a point, but that's not the point of this video. What I want to do is just show a trend between the two and how that can be a challenge for congregations. And I want to provide a little bit of an explanation of why hymns might be put in a certain key in the hymn book, even if it doesn't kind of fit up with the little C to C rule that we talked about last week. So let me get into my rangefinder here. So I'm going to take two traditional hymns and compare them to modern arrangements of those hymns to avoid kind of a cherry-picking effect. So I'm starting here with Crown Him with Many Crowns, one of my favorites actually from childhood. And you can see here that it has a lovely range of one octave, and in the key of C, it goes from that C to C range, and it fits within our rules. And you can see here this key analysis chart is actually a new feature since last week. Very bright and colorful. Red is bad, in case that wasn't obvious. But you can go through here and it gives you every key, and it gives it a color based on lowest note, highest note, the percentage of the song spent below middle C, percentage of the song spent above high C, and what percent of the song is spent singing low, grumbly runs of notes and long runs of high straining notes. And again, the very bottom here is a numerical strain score that basically should give you an idea of how badly you're going to strain your congregation one way or the other. So it's actually almost a tie here in terms of the strain score between the key of B and the key of C, and most musicians would prefer the key of C to the key of B, just with all the accidentals. In terms of the distribution of notes in the song, you can see that it's just got a nice gentle hill in the middle. You're not spending huge amounts of time at the extreme high end or low end. And at the bottom here, the pitch map just gives you a visual representation of the length of the notes and how high they are. So let's compare this to an arrangement of Crown Him with Many Crowns done by Chris Tomlin and a number of co-writers, I imagine, called Crown Him Majesty. And you can see that the range went from 1 octave to 1.4 octaves, so almost another half octave there. And if you look at the key chart here, there's a lot more red than there was before, just for comparison. What that means is that because of the extra almost half an octave, it can be difficult to place this song into a key that would be comfortable for the congregation. So even the lowest score is a lot more of a strain than the original hymn. And I put this in the key of A because it kind of balances out the pros and cons of this particular arrangement. And in terms of the distribution of notes, there's still a nice healthy hill in the middle, but there's a lot more time spent on the extremes of the range. And you can see here, this is actually just the verses, verse 1 and verse 2. The original, and the choruses go up quite high and stay there, and the bridge goes up even higher and stays up there for longer. So there's probably better ways to adapt this hymn if you do want to bring it into a modern context and still be singable for a congregation. Okay, on to another old favorite, Amazing Grace. Again, you can see that in the key of F, it's usually done in G, but in the key of F, it puts you in that sweet spot from C to C. And you can see on the key analysis chart there that actually the lowest score belongs to the lovely key of E. However, in the key of E, you spend time below that middle C. So it might be in your best interest to actually just go with the key of F. The difference between the strain scores are pretty minimal. And you can see that lovely hill where the middle of the vocal range is where most of the notes are. And we all know Amazing Grace. We know that it hits that high note and holds it for a little while, but you only have to do it once per verse. So let's compare this to a modern arrangement of Amazing Grace called Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone, by Chris Tomlin. Interestingly enough, this is one of the 3 modern takes on Amazing Grace that are in my own Amazing Grace medley. Feel free to check out the link for that. Again, we've gone from the original hymn of 1 whole octave range to 1.4 octaves. So we're kind of stretching things. There's more red on the chart here. Now I've put this into the key of D. It has the lowest strain score, and it has kind of the least amount of time spent outside of our lovely C to C range there. And you still have that lovely hill in the middle there, but you do spend some time on the extreme edges. This is probably a better example of an adapted hymn because you're not having huge amounts of time spent at the extremes of the range. So it is singable. Many of those low A's are just really just tapping that low note, and the high D that you would hit in this key, it just tickles it and comes back down. So that's actually not too bad. So in a conversation I had a week ago or so, it said to me, well, yeah, I guess that's true about the vocal range of hymns, that they're narrower and about an octave, but I recently visited a church and that sings out of the hymnal, and it was super, super high. Now this person happened to be a woman with quite a low voice, contralto, and so I went and checked it out. And if you go back to our first example, Crown Him with Many Crowns, it's actually done in the key of E flat, not in that ideal key of C that we mentioned. So why is that? Well, if you have to remember a little bit about the context that this hymn was written for congregations reading sheet music out of a hymn book that have facility with vocal harmony and a smaller repertoire to work with. So you can learn the song, you can learn one of the 4 vocal parts that fit your vocal range. So in terms of the melody here for sopranos, it goes from E flat to high E flat, which is reasonable for the soprano vocal range. And all of the other parts in here stay in the sweet spots for those particular voice types. If you were to try to drop this down from E flat to a C, the baritone voices would have to sing a low E flat, which is kind of a stretch, except for like true basses, and there really aren't that many. So, and the other thing is that when you're singing 4-part harmony, you do have limitations in terms of the vocal range of your melody, because you have to be able to squeeze those 4 parts within the ranges of the 4 different voice types without the parts crossing over. That's kind of a no-no for choral composition. And our good friend Amazing Grace, as you can see in this hymn book example here, is done in the key of G, and the lowest note is a low D, and the highest is a high D. Again, this melody would not be challenging for soprano singers, and all of the other voice types stay within the range where they're quite comfortable. So I hope this little breakdown's been helpful for you. I don't want to belabor the differences between traditional hymns and contemporary songs too much. It's just important for worship leaders to recognize, and that's where the rangefinder tool comes in handy, that there are some songs that are better choices than others. If you really enjoy a particular song and it's a bit more challenging for a congregation in terms of the vocal range, try to make it that only one song in your service is that challenging. And if you can find a way to adapt songs to fit them in a more comfortable range, whether it's removing octave jumps or whatnot, it really is worth doing to maximize participation in worship. We're commanded to sing, and when we come together as a congregation, we have to make compromises in terms of being able to sing together. If I were singing at home, I would do these songs in whatever key felt right for me. But the keys that work for me don't work for congregations for the most part. So next week, I actually want to talk about an issue that is becoming more and more prevalent in contemporary worship songwriting, and that is the issue of octave jumping. So we're going to, again, use the rangefinder tool to show some of the consequences of these songs jumping octaves, and discuss, well, what can you do with these songs if they're not doable by the average person in your congregation? So these videos are brought to you by my patrons on Patreon. Their support gives me the time that I need to work on my rangefinder tool and to record these videos. You can visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/DavidWesley. I make these videos because I believe that the church deserves leaders that grow, and I want to equip worship leaders with the knowledge and skills that they need to lead their people most effectively and to create atmospheres where people can encounter God through worship, through singing, and not put up unnecessary barriers to participation. So I hope to see you next week.